Welcome everyone to the In Her Own Right Symposium, a celebration of our work over the past 5 years to digitize primary source documents of women working for their own and other women's rights, 1820 to 1920, and make that content and their stories accessible to as wide a range of users as possible. I'm Margery, Director of Special Collections at Temple University Libraries, and a member of the project and symposium team for In Her Own Right. It's been a joy for me and a very successful exercise in collaboration to work with the In Her Own Right project team. Currently, Margaret Graham of the Drexel University College of Medicine Legacy Center, Celia Kaust-Ellenbogen of Swarthmore College Libraries, Managing Director of Paxcal, and Project Manager Lindsay Van Tyne on the project and on organizing this symposium. Past team members who have contributed their unique skills include Heather Williver-Farr, Caroline Hayden, Christina Larocco, Kat Antonelli, and Laura Blanchard. We'd also like to thank the staff of the over 20 institutions in the region who are working with us to identify, digitize, and describe relevant content. Other staff who have served on the technology and other committees, the scores of interested archivists, librarians, and grad students who participated in metadata enhancement and evaluation events, some of whom are chairing sessions and presenting today and tomorrow, our advisory board members, and our technology partner, Neomind Labs. We're grateful to the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries for hosting the project, to the granting agencies that you saw on the opening screen, who supported our work, to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Swarthmore College, and Temple University for serving as fiscal agents, and to the institutional sponsors of the symposium, the Bates Center for the Study of the History of Nursing at the University of Pennsylvania, Bryn Mawr College Libraries, the Drexel University College of Medicine Legacy Center, the Drexel University Lenfest Center for Cultural Partnerships, Paxcal, and Temple University Libraries, and especially to the Friends Historical Association for funding the live closed captioning. They have enabled us to offer the symposium for free to currently almost 350 registrants. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape people, traditional custodians of the land from which we are managing these programs, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. For those of you who are joining us from other regions of the country, please take a moment to acknowledge the people on whose traditional lands you live and work, and over which our virtual programs fly today and tomorrow. And during this Women's History Month, we also acknowledge our foremothers, some of whose stories we are sharing through this project and symposium. And now let's move on to the first program, Portals to the Documentary History of Women's Activism. First, a few housekeeping or Zoom keeping notes. During this session, we've disabled chat for attendees and are using it only as a way to send messages to all of you. So if you have questions for the panelists, or if you're experiencing technical issues and would like our assistance, please submit them through the Q&A option, which should be visible to you at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to post your questions for the panelists at any time. We'll save all of them for the Q&A period at the end of the session. I'll be speaking briefly about the In Her Own Right project. And today we also welcome our colleagues, Rachel Guberman, digital humanist for the Long 19th Amendment Project, and Jennifer Weintraub, head of digital collections and services, both from the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, speaking on collaborative commemoration, Schlesinger Library's Long 19th Amendment Project portal, and Shanae Yvette Urain, Director of Community and Digital Public Library of America on the DPLA's project Black Women's Suffrage, A Digital History of Disobedience. Please refer to the bio notes and abstracts in the online program for more information. So back almost 5 or 6 years ago now, the Philadelphia Consortium of Special Collections Libraries was casting about for the next big project. And a group of staff from participating institutions gathered and noticed that the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote in 2020 was looming, and decided to gather and write a grant proposal to work on a project around that. Understanding that women's suffrage did not spring up independent of other women's activism prior to the 1920 vote, we decided to digitize content documenting women working for their own other rights from 1820 to 1920, leading up to the passage of that 19th Amendment. We are indeed grateful to our granting agencies for the almost $1 million of funding that they've supplied to us. And I want to also recognize some of the initial participating institutions, which have grown to over 20 at this point. Initially, we just thought we were digitizing, but the components expanded. We gathered a variety of groups of people, the extremely talented project management team, advisory boards from scholars all over the country. We hired a surveyor to visit repositories, write collection descriptions, and identify potential material for digitization. We gathered volunteer standards, procedures, and tech committee members from the participating institutions. And then we started looking at what we were actually producing. So we have the website, context in essays and other content. We did user testing. We've held metadata enhancement events, and we're working on a Hidden Voices project, which I'll talk about in a bit. Some of the resources that appear on the website or will shortly appear on the website are listed here. We took a wholesale and retail approach, and for that concept, I want to recognize Laura Blanchard, former executive director of School. We wanted both raw material that researchers could work with on their own and curated content that would guide less experienced researchers in using primary sources. So obviously we have the digitized content. We also gathered collection guides specifically targeted towards content at repositories that were relevant to our theme. We are building what we like to call some prosopography around the women who networked across various topics in activist circles. We have contextualizing essays. We also are building a subject guide visualization. We're starting projects around collaborative description for those descriptive geeks in the audience, EAC, CPF, and SNAC, which is social networks and archival context. And as you'll hear shortly, our content will be appearing through other portals. Our brand new website is up and running. It's beautiful, and it features many of the products that we want to offer our users. And here are just a few more highlights. You can search the raw material, and this is just an example. When I searched on housing, we got 1,348 results, including a collection description, individual documents, and some folder level content with faceted searching on the left. We have exhibits which provide context. Some of the content are essays written around themes prevalent to the content. Others are blog posts that are participating staff members and graduate students have written. And also we've been working with undergraduate history majors to build primary source sets and lesson plans that will provide learning tools to teachers and students. A word about technology. This is on the site, so I won't belabor it, but we're glad to talk about what Neomind Labs and our staff have developed that have enabled us to do all this great work. We also, as I said, wanted to make the raw material available. So we've been doing metadata enhancement and have started downloading data sets from the metadata in order to do some digital humanities work. So if you're into that, this is the place to come. And this is one example of how we've used the data sets. It's a subject collection visualization that you can go to the site and play with. But it's our way of creating a subject guide in a new and creative format. We're also starting to work with Palladio, so stay tuned for more interesting visualizations of content. I could tell stories about the content of our collections forever, but let me just highlight a few. Helen Parrish created diaries during her work for the Octavia Hill Association, which was a private housing association in Philadelphia. She's an example of a difficult woman because she wanted to help others on her own terms, and they had to meet her requirements before she'd work with them. We have the big names in women's history. Lucretia Mott. I don't know that I need to talk much about her, a prominent Philadelphia Quaker and leader in reform movements. We are privileged to have 3 African-American friendship albums from the Library Company of Philadelphia in the collection, and are working with Howard University to digitize a 4th that is connected to these 3 and will help us build out the set. And working with the Bates Center, we've digitized the content of application forms for student nurses training to be training at Mercy Hospital and Frederick Douglass Hospital. A wonderful insight into African-American women in the late 19th, early 20th century. As we continued to work on the project, we realized how challenging it is to gather content about underrepresented women. And so we very deliberately wrote into our current NEH grant a Hidden Voices component to identify collections at smaller repositories and potentially in private hands that would not otherwise be digitized and exposed, to help those institutions through our grant funding to leverage some of their digitization and build capacity, and also to work to identify less traditional primary sources that might help us document these voices. And these are some of our partners in that project. We are addressing sustainability options and have written some of that into our grant proposals and our project plan. So we hope that the content will live on and be accessible to researchers for a very long time. You know where we are, and we're always glad to receive questions, comments, suggestions for improvement to the site and the aggregator. So please be in touch and let us know what what you're doing with our content. We'd really love to know that it's being used and educating students and scholars all over the world. So I will now turn this over to my colleagues at the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge.
Hi, everyone. It's this is my first experience actually doing a webinar. So anyway, it's so great over Zoom. So it's so great to be here. I'm Jennifer Weintraub. I'm the head of digital collections at Schlesinger Library, and I'm here with my colleague Rachel Guberman, who also has her camera on. I'm going to talk first, and Rachel is the digital humanist and sort of the leader of the long 19th Amendment portal project. I'm going to put in the chat our URL. One second. And then I'm going to share my screen. So 1 second. Actually, Rachel, would
want me to grab that for you?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you. I will share my screen. There we go. All right. So I'm just showing you the main screen of our long 19th Amendment project. So I want to give you a little history on our portal. This project began back in around 2017, maybe a little bit earlier, when we at the Schlesinger Library also realized that the centennial for the 19th Amendment was looming. And our faculty director, Jane Kaminsky, was actually asked to propose a grant to the Mellon Foundation about the 19th Amendment. And she developed a steering committee of researchers and scholars in the area and some other librarians. And we developed a project to create an expansive and inclusive view of the suffrage movement. So not just the suffrage movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries, but movement throughout the 20th centuries and into the 21st centuries on voting rights, women and voting rights. So our project is really a scholarly and public programming project. There, over the course of the project, which is still going on, but there has been some limitations because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been academic year faculty fellowships, there have been summer faculty fellowships, there have been some teacher fellowships, we've had exhibits and a conference that was prepared for in September 2020, and some of you may have attended that. And of course, because of COVID, and while they were preparing this project, we also realized that there would be nothing, if we did all that, there'd be nothing at the end, really. And so there was a small part of the grant that said, and we will create a portal to digitize materials, primary source materials about the suffrage movement, as well as voting rights movements in the United States in the 20th and 21st century. So just a small amount of mention became this portal. And we were very motivated by partnerships we had been working on as a library in our relation, more than it's been a while now that we've realized that Schlesinger Library had mostly collected material from privileged, wealthy white women on the East Coast. And we really have been trying to collect material from more different kinds of more diverse Americans. And we've had relationships with some historically Black colleges and universities and the project history makers. And we've learned a lot about some of the issues involved with smaller institutions and some of the resource limitations they have for digitization of their wonderful primary source collections. We've had, for the last 5 years, we've had a curator for race and ethnicity. And when creating a portal, we wish to enlarge the corpus of material available to researchers. So Schlesinger itself has a great deal of suffrage material. In fact, some of you may know that our founding collection was given to Radcliffe by an alumna and suffragist and a fan of suffragist, Maud Wood Park. And her collection was the founding of the Women's Archives and then Schlesinger Library for the History women in America. Over the years, we had welcomed many collections into our library, but we definitely had a lack of material on Black suffragists and organizations during the time period of the suffrage movement. So the goal of the project was not just to provide access to Schlesinger materials, but to more materials all around the country, and to also encourage or somehow seed digitization wherever possible. So we had a lot of grand plans during this time, and I think we've done a good job, even though, like many of you, our projects for the commemoration of the 19th Amendment have been limited this year. So I'll just talk about some of the elements of our portal, and I'm going to talk about the collection search at the end. So I'm going to actually start from the bottom here with teaching. And in our teaching section, we have two interesting projects that are really meant as we wanted to develop some lesson plans and other classroom materials for high school and advanced high school students and college students. Those were the main audiences. And the suffrage syllabus in particular has been an amazing project that Rachel really has helped spearhead with the members of the committee for our suffrage conference that happened in September. And you'll see that this is developed there's units, each of which are supposedly like 2 weeks in a course, and they're of different years in American history and why they've been important to women's suffrage. And there's readings and there's questions and lesson plans. And these are all scholars in this area. And the last one was developed by Harvard undergrads who worked with us last summer on some projects. So that's definitely worth looking at. We also have the Suffrage School, which you may have seen. This was really a COVID-19 project where the communications department at Schlesinger and Jane and Radcliffe and Schlesinger, we all thought of this way. Each scholar chooses a document from our collections, which they found particularly interesting or useful, and they reflect on it in just 2-minute videos. And they also find the document in our collections. These are really fun and interesting. So I definitely recommend you look at those. We also have a number of other projects. As I said, one of the key components was some public programming for our whole Long 19th Amendment project. So Seeing Citizens was our first, we have 2 exhibits coming. Seeing Citizens was the first one. It was literally being put up in our gallery when we had to shut the library down on March 13th, and it's never gone up physically. But fortunately, Allison Lang, the curator, and Rachel and the committee members for the exhibit had mostly figured out exactly where everything was going to go and created this wonderful online exhibit, which is definitely worth checking out. It has material from Schlesinger, but also from other collections, Library of Congress, New York Public, and some other interesting projects, some other interesting collections. We also worked on a project with a teacher from Cambridge and Latin, Martin Kahn. He had some summer fellowships at the library and is very interested in changing the way American history is taught with a focus on diversity, inclusion, and women's history. And he developed a project with the students at Cambridge and Latin. He developed a club called Her Vote, and they decided to start figuring out how to get information about how people were feeling about voting, especially women, 100 years after the 1920, the first 1920 election in which women were able to vote. And they did a social media project. They've had some sessions with various elected representatives, including Elizabeth Warren and the mayor of Cambridge. And we're sort of the repository for this. We're the repository for Her Vote. We also have a suffrage bibliography that Rachel's been leading with some of our students who've been working with us. That's a Zotero library, which is definitely worth checking out. Loads of secondary sources there. You could spend all day there. And then we have a data section where we're collecting voting rights data. And we're also working on some sort of, the first project is one of our student workers has been transcribing material from paper resources or microfilm resources. And this is from the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She's been transcribing like lists of their officers, lists of their addresses, lists of their roles, and all this can be used in future digital humanities projects. So we're working on projects like that, and we'll continue to over the course of the project. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about our collection search, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rachel. And so like our projects, we have gotten a lot of metadata. We have some search instructions. We have metadata from our collections, which had never been brought together before, I should just say. So this was like a great opportunity for Schlesinger to pull together all of our suffrage material that had been digitized and was digitized for this project. We also have material from other libraries. Right now, we are welcoming any metadata from libraries that have, I'm gonna close up the search instructions here. So I just searched for Alice Paul, and you can get a link to her the finding aid for her materials at Schlesinger, but also individual records from libraries across the country. We also are trying to have a lot of material, not just from the Northeast. So fortunately, we've based, one of our inspirations was the Umbra project at University of Minnesota, which is a focused portal using a lot of DPLA metadata on African-American resources. But they also are collecting metadata from material that is not digitized, and that's something that we're interested in as well. So that when we have metadata from a collection that's not digitized, we then direct you to where you can find it physically. So, because we realize that a lot of material is not digitized yet, even though we've all been digitizing for so long, different libraries are at different stages in this. We also are working on, we have, filters for date, formats, topics, and institutions. So you can look for a specific, in specific institutions in ways you wish. And I think I'm going to leave it here right now and then pass it over to Rachel. And if you guys have questions, we can talk at the end.
Hi, everybody. I'm not going to share my screen. You're just going to get me. So part of the real kind of mission of our project has been to open up the possibilities for scholarship in the history of the women's suffrage movement, and more broadly in kind of the gendered history of voting rights in the United States. And to do that, we really wanted to make sure that the collections that we bring together in the portal represent the broadest possible diversity of women in this country, whether that's geographically, as Jen mentioned, but also in terms of class, race, immigrant status, et cetera. And as Jen mentioned, we are only able to do that a little bit from within our own collections. And so we realized very quickly that in order to do this, we were going to need to bring in material from outside institutions. And thinking about how to do that in a way that really does sort of democratize access and also bring in as many voices as possible has been part of the challenge. So when we started this, the shorthand I was using when I went around to ask people, to sort of interview people about what they would want in a portal like this was, are we building suffrage DPLA or are we building suffrage archives grid? Right? Are we building a project that takes you directly to individual digitized objects that you can read and look at, in their entirety? Or are we building kind of a roadmap to the universe of collections that exists with links to finding aids and catalog records, and that's it? And as Jen said, kind of where we settled is in the middle. We were building suffrage Umbra in the end, which sort of straddles those two things. And I think that's part of how I would situate us as being a little bit distinct from both In Her Own Right and from Shanae's wonderful project at DPLA, because we have collections and items that come from repositories across the country. So we're trying to be as geographically diverse as possible. And we've been really fortunate to bring in a good number of collections from the West and from the South and Southwest. And we also have a lot of collection level records that just take you to finding aids rather than to complete, individual digitized items. And that was I think an important strategic choice for us, because we recognized that, first of all, we don't have the resources to digitize everybody's materials, unfortunately. And also for a whole variety of reasons, lots of repositories would be reluctant to, send us their stuff, even if we could offer that. But many of the collections that we were most interested in including are housed at institutions that have historically been under-resourced and often remain under-resourced. And so they haven't been able to do major digitization projects. And it was really important to us to make sure that we were not replicating those inequities in our digital platform. So the major reason for sort of trying to create a platform that would be able to accommodate all of these different types of records was to be sure that we could include as many as possible. So we will accept any level of metadata that you have. If you are able to give us, direct links to individual digitized objects, that's terrific, and we want them. If you can only send us to a finding aid or even a catalog record, we want that too, because for scholars coming to use this material, knowing, hey, there is a terrific collection in Eastern Tennessee, and here is the repository and the name of the person you should call or email is also extremely valuable. And so I hope that what scholars will find when they come to use our collections is that it brings together a group of materials that have not typically been put in conversation with each other. And that's partly because we're able to bring together materials kind of to take them wherever they are and at whatever level they've been, of description they're at. And also, I think because we've defined the scope fairly broadly to include not just activism specifically in the service of passing the 19th Amendment, but to think about the history of gender and voting rights in the United States, both before and after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so we're interested in, for example, Black women working on voting rights in the mid-20th century. We're interested in immigrant communities and their relationship to the vote. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we've tried to understand what gender and voting rights or women and voting rights means to be as sort of broad and open-ended as possible. And then the other piece is, I think, part of a broader, more general Schlesinger commitment, but it certainly applies here, which is that all of our materials are open access. And so, right, I think combining the digitized and the undigitized materials and really going out of our way to locate resources in smaller repositories has been part of a mission to bring as many resources on sort of the supply side in as possible. But on the demand side of this, also, we try to open it up to the broadest possible array of users by making sure that everything is open access. And that's a commitment in general at our library. We're one of, I think, 2 libraries at Harvard that don't require any credentials of any kind to get in. You don't just show up anymore because of COVID, but anyone can make an appointment. You used to just show up. So all of our materials have always been open access, and that is a commitment that carries over to this portal. The one thing I think we sort of have struggled with a little bit there is, we had a couple scholars point out to us when we did some user interviews that actually the paywall around a lot of proprietary databases, where especially earlier material that's relevant to this topic lives, is one of the huge barriers to access. And it's not just that if your institution doesn't subscribe to a database, you can't access the content. It's often that if your institution doesn't subscribe to a database, you don't even know that it exists. And so I've been thinking increasingly, right, about that tension, that we are only providing open access materials, but is it actually also valuable to let people know, like, hey, this proprietary database exists in the world. You might want to try to get your hands on it. So that's something that we're sort of actively thinking about, and also how to include, older digitized microfilm sets, which were often projects that incorporated material from many repositories and that are now also proprietary, but, to make sure that people at least are aware of the broadest possible array of resources. So yeah, I think this sort of the commitment to intersectionality and to sort of expanding the scope of scholarship on suffrage has been integral to this whole long 19th Amendment project in all of its aspects. In this digital component, I think a big part of the way that we've tried to advance that mission has been through these sort of technical aspects of thinking about what kinds of material we can accept and in what formats and how to make that as diverse and open as it can be. And I'm happy to talk more about any part of this later. Thanks.
So over to Shanae.
Okay, sorry about that. I am so pleased this morning to be presenting with Jennifer and Rachel, who I met back in the before times, back in October 2019, to talk about these two projects and where there might be overlap. And hearing them talk, I'm thinking about all the things that I could have planned to say in this presentation about how we pulled from DPLA's aggregation, that process and looking through the metadata records and thinking about our users and visitors and how they might interact with some of the material that happens to be harmful in our network's harmful language description, but I'll just stick to what I prepared and do a tour of the site and talk about some of our partners. So I'm Shanae Vetmarain. I am the Director of Community Engagement for DPLA, and I coordinate outreach to promote DPLA's unique value and engage cultural heritage institutions across the country. I am also very privileged to serve as the coordinator of the Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection. The Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection, some of these names: Mary Church Terrell, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Anna Julia Cooper, Ida B. Wells Barnett. These are women who played significant roles leading up to and during the United States women's suffrage movement and beyond. Yet, as Rachel pointed out, their stories and contributions are not widely known, and the critical roles Black women played at the forefront of the campaign for women's rights are too often forgotten. This gap in America's public consciousness is rooted in the history of racism and exclusion within the suffrage movement, which resulted in white women emerging as the movement's primary protagonists, while Black women were effectively wiped from the narrative. And the Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection is a collaborative project to provide digital access to materials that are documenting the roles and experiences of Black women in the suffrage movement, and more broadly, kind of extending our timeline of women's rights, voting rights, and civic activism between the 1850s and 1960s, even up to the present with the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter movement. The collection includes photographs, correspondence, speeches, events, programs, publications, oral histories, and other artifacts. And the collection explores both the roots of women's activism in Black communities and the ongoing struggle to secure, protect, and to use the right to vote beyond the suffrage movement, and also those intersections between voting rights and other civil rights. By combining our archival materials from the Digital Public Library of America, from our network of over 4,000 institutions, which included a lot of deep metadata work and curatorial work, we also partnered with new institutions inside and outside of our network to digitize new content. In the collection, it's for a public audience. We seek to engage students, educators, and researchers in the exploration and dialogue around this very often overlooked chapter in the nation's history. The project was funded by Pivotal Ventures, which is an investment and incubation company created by Melinda Gates, who has a passion for women's storytelling. DPLA granted the bulk of these funds to collaborators at the Atlanta University Center, and Tuskegee University, both HBCUs with collections documenting women's history of organizing for political action in the South. We also awarded funds to the Avery Research Center and Amistad Research Center, institutions committed to collecting, preserving, and providing open access to the history and culture of African Americans in diaspora. We also gave funds to the Southern California Library, which documents and makes accessible histories of struggle that challenge racism and other systems of oppression. And this library holds extensive collections of the histories of community resistance in Los Angeles and beyond. Recognizing the legacies of racism and white supremacy in libraries and how that has resulted in the failure of libraries to develop collections that are truly representative of the public we serve, DPLA as a part of our strategic plan and vision are prioritizing projects and building on the Black women's suffrage model to ask what's going on in the world. This 2020 was about the 19th Amendment. In the future, it's additional projects based on what we've learned for the Black women's suffrage digital collection. And we're gathering our network around making our unique resources more accessible and asking what librarians and what our practices and policies can do about upending that. Okay, here is our tour. I think this video is going to start. Our goal with the new digital collection is to provide visitors an easy way to learn about Black women's suffrage and to browse information based on their own interests while also incorporating some of the previously curated collections from the dp.la site. Our About page, the landing page, provides navigational direction and sets expectations for what visitors can expect to find. Here on the page, visitors can toggle to read a timeline that reveals the breadth and depth of Black women's activism over more than a century, and short biographies that give context to the materials to both well-known and lesser-known suffragists and activists. We built the site keeping in mind that this is, a story that has not been told, so that visitors might come to the collection not knowing what to search for. So visitors can learn more about our project collaborators and how the site was curated and delve into the collections of interest. The collection was designed to give access to materials in a way, like I shared, that the stories speak for themselves without appropriation or colonization. And that's all a part of our mission to empower people to learn, grow, and to contribute to a diverse and better functioning society. A huge part of this work is ensuring that collections are well described, that the records are labeled with full names, places, organizations that the women were involved in. These names of the partners in the struggle, all of which makes them more discoverable and provides reliable info about under-researched women. So what you all are seeing now is a timeline that we had reviewed by one of the symposium's fellow presenters, Dr. Allison Parker at the University of Delaware. We hope that visitors use the collection to explore these connections between the history we've been taught and the history uncovered by primary resources created by those whose direct action brought us to this moment 100 years later. And I'll also share that this site, the actual design, the shades, the color theme, how it was oriented, is the brainchild of the DPLA staff, myself as a curator, and an African-American woman named Jasmine Atwood, who we hired specifically for her expertise and her experience working at Google and doing user experience and website development. This site is unlike other dp.la sites, including our local hub sites and the dp.la project. We wanted to bring a high fidelity, bright, and also easy to navigate site. So what we're seeing now are the Ida B. Wells Barnett papers that were shared with us as part of a partnership with the University of Chicago. And a big part of this work was centering the voices of librarians and curators as subject specialists. And we also were interested in how these materials could be used for teaching. So we invited Professor Allison Robinson, who would use the Ida B. Wells Barnett papers and pictures in her class on reconstructing Black women's visibility. And as a network, we talked about how photographs and records bring Black women's activism to the fore. And it was an example, a real life praxis of how digital collections can be taught. So that's the Ida B. Wells Barnett. I'm sorry, this is the video is a little bit slower. Blame Screencastify. So the collections and their digitization represents another opportunity for researchers, students, and the public to interact more intimately with the legacies of inspiring women, and also to go through the photographs and all of the different materials that make connections to the present moment and the civic activism of Black women. Here, I did a search for the term protest and looked for a photograph that shows students protesting segregation at the Georgia State Capitol. And we'll see that in a second. And you can just see through the results, the variety of materials that we have. And we are excited to have all of these different records be in context and in conversation with one another, because we want visitors to look at something like this protest search photo and ask the very important question about how images are created, what is metadata, how are stories about people, places, and events told and projected, who is responsible for the images, how do they tell the story, who are the sources, what's left out, and who should be remembered or forgotten. I invite you all to ask questions after this, but continue the conversation with us. Some of the curating and our metadata query building, all of the technical considerations of the site are shared in a series of blog posts by DPLA developer Audrey Altman. The series is called Searching for Black Women in the Archives. We're also looking to create new scholarship with the Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection. And we have funding to support new digitization for materials that would be a good fit for an ebook that is based on the original letters of Black women suffragists, and it's called By the Quill of Her Pen. And this will be an EPUB that includes the original document and then also an OCR scan. And we're looking for artists and editors to also, do illustrations and provide summaries and original research around these letters. So check out the project and follow us on social media. And now I'll stop so you all can engage with us and ask brilliant questions. Thank you.
Okay, so fellow panelists, if you could turn your cameras and audio back on. I'm not seeing any questions yet, but I have one. I think we're all assuming that if we build it, they will come. So we built these amazing resources and we're publicizing them every way we can. But I'm wondering if you have gathered any preliminary user information or done any assessment work, or how you plan to do that.
I can say a little bit. We do keep track of how much our portal is being used. We are sort of developing another plan for I wouldn't say relaunching, but for the next academic year, because this one has been so difficult. And we've sort of been keeping track of how people a few people, we've heard about some conversation on Twitter, which is like nice for us to know about. And we're developing we're sort of thinking like, September, although we realize like a lot of the impetus for, the centennial is now in the past, but people are still teaching about this. It's still an important part of, of coursework. And so, yeah.
And I'll just add, I think from the preliminary user data that we've gathered, because we have been, doing like Google analytics on the site, it seems like the suffrage syllabus has gotten a lot of traction, and we know that that's being used in college classrooms, in some high school classrooms, in some kind of programs for returning non-traditional students, which is really exciting, and that those resources have been used a lot. We also know that the Suffrage School videos are being used in a lot of classrooms this year. I think, there are these very engaging short videos, and they have questions that come with them. And we know that partly from the analytics and partly because in the hot second that the site was down because Radcliffe was launching its new site, we got a number of panicked emails wondering why people couldn't access the page for like part of a day. So I think those things have certainly gotten a lot of traction. We don't have as good data about the collection search yet, because it turns out that needed to be done separately in a separate app. So we're working on improving the analytics for that, and especially we're interested in what people are searching for. But we're also growing the collections really quickly. I think, a month ago, I think we had something like 6,000 records, and today we have about 10,000 records, and I have probably 5 more repositories sending us stuff this week. So I think that is expanding really rapidly, and I hope that will, that there'll be a commensurate increase in use of the site as we add more materials, and as we are able to ingest all of the metadata from Sinead's project and from In Her Own Right, which we hope to do very soon.
Great. Thanks, Sinead.
We don't have a lot of data. We too use Google Analytics as part of our partnership with Pivotal Ventures. Excuse me, we've been doing a lot of outreach, and one of the hugest, spikes in visitorship of the site was after the Well-Read Black Girl Festival. And that was back in November. It's an online book club. This is a new audience. I think 100,000 members are part of it online. Not all of those, people attended the festival, but it was an opportunity to talk to a public user base who's interested in reading in Black women's stories about the collection. What I found on Google Analytics, which has been really interesting thus far, is that people are not using the timeline, and they are not arriving at the key suffrage bios. They are going straight to search, which is fascinating to me. It makes us want to do more user experience. We've also shared and presented on the collection at a number of, allied organization and professional association meetings. And as a result of that, we've gotten quite a bit of invitations to Zoom, to Zoom classes. So I've been working the Zoom streets, and it's been interesting to hear from grad students and undergrads what they think of the site. And one of the most striking bits of feedback from a class at the City University of New York, the class is called Remote Archival Encounters, and they were, doing reviews of digital sites. One of the students picked the Black women's suffrage site before knowing that we were coming to the class, and she interpreted and was expecting that the primary source sets that are about African American history and also, the suffrage as it exists universally, she thought that all of those primary source sets would be about stories featuring Black women. So it made us think about what our what we thought the users would want, rather what they experienced, and that if you go to a site about Black women's suffrage, everything on the site is going to be about Black women's suffrage. So we're taking that feedback and considering how to build out the site and how to do more targeted research for users.
Can I just add to what Sinead was saying? I was struck. We've done various iterations of user testing, beginning with pretty extensive user interviews of scholars, college students, high school teachers, and librarians and archivists at the outset when we were sort of trying to develop the project and think about what we wanted while we were still trying to answer the suffrage DPLA or suffrage archive question. And it was striking to me the actually really different answers that those different kind of audiences gave, and thinking about how to build a resource that would be valuable to all of those groups. And in more recent rounds of user testing, I feel like we've struck a pretty good balance. I think, people in general seem pretty satisfied with what we're able to offer, but it's difficult to sort of thread the needle there when you have multiple different audiences that you're trying to reach with a single site.
Thanks, Rachel and Shani and Jen. So a question from Heather Sharkey at UPenn, directed to Shanae. Can you tell us about the process of developing an ebook and best practices in publishing a collection like this one?
Sure, I'll talk about the By the Quill of Her Pen, what we're wanting to do with that, which is quite experimental. We've heard from DPLA network members, that there's a fear that ebooks are taken over, but I saw, myself and our ebooks coordinator saw the Black Women's Suffrage collection as an opportunity to kind of bring both sides of the house together and to be experimental in what we did. So we were looking through correspondence from the collection, and we said, wow, we're thinking about, like context. We're thinking about providing descriptive information. We hear from Google, and we know from our usage statistics and whether sites are being indexed, that people, that our users they interact with the internet in the way that the internet answers questions that they're asking. So we wanted with this book to answer those questions. And the idea is to expand on the DPLA's ebook publishing model and create a collection of 20 to 30 letters. And it's going to be, open access. The publishing agreements with authors or an editor who contributes to the work, they'll retain copyright for it, and we're going to use a Creative Commons license to apply to any chapters that are describing and summarizing those letters. So the book will reside in DPLA's open bookshelf, and that is an engagement tool for use by schools and libraries, and we're hoping to attract a large audience of readers with that. And DPLA, back in 2019, we published a report on the investigation into the Russian interference, and we're very well, known for the Mueller report, which won a best nonfiction book from Digital Book World. We also released the impeachment papers, but we haven't done anything like this where we've taken cultural heritage materials, primary source materials, and put them in conversation with scholars and had more of a creative product. So that's what we're looking to do with this By the Quill of Her Pen project. Was there a second part to the question that I missed?
No, I think you've covered it. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for asking.
So I'm going to skip down to a question or a comment. Might the fact that people are going straight to search reflect that the public has been trained by Google in how to access information? Do institutions need help to shaping the public's experience, understanding assumptions about how to do this kind of research? Jen, I noticed you were maybe thinking about responding. I think we've thought a lot about this, and we're finding particularly public school teachers and undergrads and 9 through 12, K through 12, really do need some context and structure and direction So that's why In Her Own Right has this wholesale research where if you're an experienced researcher, yeah, you can go right to the search and go for the stuff. But if you're looking for something more focused or something to help people as an entry point into using primary sources for the first time, some of the context is really helpful and worthwhile. I think we might have time for one more question. Does anybody else want to comment on the straight to search?
I'll just say, I think one of the things we've thought about developing kind of document collections similar to what both of your projects have, and that's been part of the consideration is, you know, whether they'll get use, whether that will be a useful entry point for people. The syllabus, I think, has been a really valuable entry point for people who are looking for a more curated experience. For us, one thing that we did find was really valuable and necessary was some very specific and detailed search instructions. And we're actually, I think it still says search instructions on the site, but we're about to change the name to like tips to make your search more effective, because we want even researchers who think that they know how to do a good search to look at the tips, which I think will improve everyone's experience. But part of what we realized is people are coming and just typing in as though they're doing a Google search. And it turns out that Google search and a Boolean search are not the same thing. And they don't get you the same results. And I think that was really frustrating to especially students in the beginning. And so we have tried, I don't know whether it's helped, but we've tried to be really, really explicit. And in the little bit of user testing I did with undergrads, it did seem to make a difference to be really direct and clear about how the search works and what you can get out of it when you use it in a more targeted way than just typing things in like you would to Google.
I think that's a good point, because we would really love people to use our faceting option, but if they're just doing, you know, drinking from the fire hose, that might not be really helpful.
I'd be curious to see later if you take a look at our instructions, what you think of them, because we did work. We put a surprising amount of effort, I would say, into making those instructions like as clear and effective as possible, because it was really a problem we noticed in the beginning, in the first iteration of the search function.
Well, we've run a little bit over, and I want everybody to have a break before the next session at 10:15. So I want to say big thanks to Jen, Rachel, and Shanae for their great presentations. We're really grateful that you were able to join us for this. And thank you. And the next session will start at 10:15 on friendship and relationships between women. So we hope to see you all back then. Thanks.